This audio is not working.
I just have heard you. Maybe you came on now.
I don't see anything. It just says commissioner meeting.
Hold on a second. Sorry. Maybe it looks like you've dropped off, and I'm not sure why. No, I see you. You're at the top of 00 counted. There's a good chance you're being heard, or that we're very close to being heard. So I'll let Shanna let us know.
Okay.
This is Ben. My protestant is chatting, says their audio doesn't work. Is there a way to fix that?
Ms. Lusk?
Hello?
Ms. Lusk? Can you hear us?
Yes, I'm here.
Thank
I
you.
can hear you.
Great, we can hear you.
Great.
Ms. Everett?
She's not on mute either. Why can no one hear us?
I could hear that.
Ms. Everett?
Here.
Thank you. Mr. Minor?
Good morning.
Good morning, sir. Going back up the roll, Mr. Ballard?
Loud and clear.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Neal?
Aye.
Mr. Tankard? Mr. Tankard?
Here.
Thank you. Mr. France is being delayed. At this time, I'd like to ask Mr. Tankard to give the invocation, please. Mr. Tankard?
Yes, sir. Lord, let us pray. Yesterday, we paid homage to the brave women and men who died in service to our country so that we may enjoy the freedoms we cherish as Americans. These proceedings today represent the best of those freedoms, our ability to imagine and aspire. The Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel is a project of those freedoms. Many thoughtful hours have gone into this effort to provide safe transportation and significant economic benefits to our Commonwealth. However, as students of your natural resources, as stewards of your natural resources, we have the freedom and responsibility to protect these beautiful resources. As Virginians, we are obligated to honor our democratic heritage. We therefore ask you to bless these proceedings and the decisions that are made today. For this we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Mr. Tankard. Let the record reflect that we do have a quorum. Ms. Block, are you with us?
Yes, I am.
Thank you, ma'am. We will proceed. The first item is the approval of the agenda. Are there any corrections, deletions, or modifications to the agenda by members of the commission or staff? If not, the chair will entertain a motion.
I move we approve the agenda as presented. John Zedrin.
Motion made by Mr. Zedrin. Is there a second to the motion?
Second by Chad Ballard.
Second by Mr. Ballard. Further discussion? Mr. Tankard?
I'm in favor. Excuse me.
Mr. Zedrin?
Yes.
Dr. Neal?
Aye.
Mr. Ballard?
Aye.
Mr. Minor?
Aye.
Ms. Lusk?
Aye.
Ms. Everett?
Aye.
Chair votes aye. Motion passes unanimous. The next item on the agenda is approval of minutes. We have to approve 2 months worth of minutes. The first will be the minutes of February 2020. Have you had an opportunity to look at the minutes? Are there any corrections, additions, or deletions to the minutes of 2020? If not, the chair will entertain a motion.
I move that we approve the minutes of February 2020 meeting. John Zedrin.
Motion made by Mr. Zedrin to approve the minutes of February 2020. Is there a second to the motion?
I'll second.
Second, Chad Ballard.
Second by Mr. Ballard. Further discussions? All in favor of the motion signify by saying aye.
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 Well, let's do that again. I'm sorry. Mr. Tankard?
Aye.
Mr. Zedrin?
Aye.
Dr. Neal?
Aye.
Mr. Ballard?
Aye.
Mr. Minor? Mr. Minor?
Aye.
Ms. Lusk? Okay. Ms. Lusk?
Aye.
Ms. Everett?
Abstain.
Abstain. Chair votes in the affirmative. Motion passes. The next are the minutes of the April 2020. Have you had a chance to review the minutes of the April 2020 meeting? If you have, are there any additions, corrections, or deletions to the minutes? If not, the chair will entertain a motion.
I move that we approve the minutes of April 28, 2020. John Zedrin.
Motion made by
Mr. Bowman?
Yes, ma'am.
Could I modify the minutes to reflect that I was in attendance, Christy Everett?
Yes, ma'am. We will make that modification.
The corrections have been made.
With that modification, John Zedrin and I move that we approve the minutes as amended.
Motion made by Mr. Zedrin with modification. Is there a second?
Second, Chad Ballard.
Second by Mr. Ballard. Further discussion? Mr. France, have you arrived yet? Mr. Tankard?
Aye.
Mr. Zedrin?
Yes.
Dr. Neal?
Aye.
Mr. Ballard?
Aye.
Mr. Minor? Mr. Minor?
Aye.
Thank you, sir. Ms. Lusk?
Aye.
Ms. Everett?
Aye.
Chair votes aye. Motion passes unanimously. Next item on the agenda are permits, projects over $500,000 with no objections and with staff recommendation for approval. Mr. Watkinson.
Yes, sir, Mr. Commissioner. Good morning, associate members. Today we have 5 so-called page 2 items. These are
Mr. Watkinson.
Yes, sir.
Recognizing your voice, do you solemnly swear the testimony that you'll give today will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Yes, sir, I do.
Proceed.
Okay, we have 5 page 2 items. These are projects over $500,000 in value. We've subjected these projects to our standard public interest review. There have been no objections, and staff is recommending approval of these projects. So with that, I will read the project description for each of the 5 projects. Item 2A, Global Links Data Center, LLC. Request authorization to horizontally drill 4 5-inch steel submarine fiber optic conduits under Sandbridge Beach and adjacent to state-owned submerged bottomlands to a distance of approximately 4,000 linear feet offshore, directly adjacent to city property located at 209 Sandbridge Road, situated along the Atlantic Ocean within the city of Virginia Beach. The conduits will remain vacant with the intent of accommodating future submarine fiber optic cable projects. In this case, staff recommends approval with a royalty of $48,000 for the total encroachment of 16,000 linear feet of state-owned submerged lands at a rate of $3 per linear foot. Item 2B, Global Links Data Center, LLC. Request authorization to horizontally drill 4 5-inch steel submarine fiber optic conduits under state-owned submerged bottomlands in the Atlantic Ocean to a distance of approximately 4,000 linear feet offshore, directly adjacent to city property located at the terminus of South Atlantic Avenue on the southern side of Rudy Inlet in Virginia Beach. The conduits will remain vacant with the intent of accommodating future submarine fiber optic cable projects. In this case, staff recommends approval with a royalty of $48,000 for the total encroachment of 16,000 linear feet of state-owned submerged bottomlands at a rate of $3 per linear foot. Item 2C, Fairfax County Department of Public Works and Environmental Services request authorization to restore and stabilize approximately 2,800 linear feet of Acatink Creek and its tributaries using natural stream channel design techniques, including stone stream bank stabilization, root wad log installation, rock veins, and drop structures as part of the Acatink Creek at Wakefield Park Restoration Project in Fairfax County. Item 2D, Alexandria Renew Enterprises request authorization to install by the open cut method a 6-foot diameter interceptor sewer line, a minimum 1.8 feet beneath a 40-foot wide section of Hoff's Run, approximately 320 square feet of riprap outfall protection, and temporary impacts along approximately 1,700 linear feet of Hoff's Run for construction access south of Jameson Avenue as part of the River Renew Tunnel System project in the city of Alexandria. And item 2E, Plains Marketing LP, request authorization to install 15 new 16-inch diameter steel hollow piles during repairs to the loading platform at Plains Marketing, that's 2201 Goodwin Neck Road along the York River in York County. In this case, staff recommends approval with adherence to sound attenuation conditions for driving steel hollow piles that include ramp-up procedures, cushion blocks, and a confined bubble curtain, and a time of year restriction from January 1 through March 31 of any year to protect juvenile alewife, blueback heron, and American shad. Those are the descriptions for the 5 page 2 projects. We'll try to answer any questions you might have.
Do any members of the commission have any questions for Mr. Watkinson on the page 2 items? They're hearing none. This is a public hearing. Does anyone in the public wish to be heard on these page 2 items? They're seeing none. The matter is before the commission.
I move that we approve page 2 items. Chad Ballard.
Motion made by Mr. Ballard. Is there a second?
I'll second, Ken Neal.
Seconded by Dr. Neal. Further discussion? All in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. Never mind. Excuse me. Me again. Mr. France, are you on board? Mr. Tankard? Mr. Tankard?
Aye.
Mr. Zedrin?
Aye.
Dr. Neal?
Aye.
Mr. Ballard?
Aye.
Ms. Minor? Mr. Minor?
Aye.
Ms. Lusk?
Aye.
Ms. Everett?
Aye.
Chair votes aye. Motion passes unanimously. Mr. Watkinson, do you have any consent agenda items at this time?
No, sir, no consent items today.
Right. Ms. Block, is there any need for a closed meeting or even more closed, what we're dealing with now, for consultation with you?
No, sir.
Thank you. The next item on the agenda is item 5, public hearing, proposal to amend Chapter 4 VAC 295010 pertaining to black sea bass to establish the commercial black sea bass fishery quota for 2020. Ms. Shanna Madsen.
All right, can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Wonderful. Okay, this is a public hearing, which is a proposal to amend Chapter 4 VAC 20-950-10 pertaining to black sea bass to establish the commercial black sea bass fishery quota for 2020 and actually for beyond, which you guys will get to see in just a moment. First slide. Oops. There we go. We're good. So in October 2019, the Mid-Atlantic Fishery Management Council and the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission established catch and landing limits for the 2020 coastwide commercial black sea bass fishery. That limit was set at 5.58 million pounds, which is a 59% increase compared to our quota at 2019 coastwide. This is due to the fact that the 2019 operational stock assessment showed a spawning stock biomass that was larger than we previously estimated. Just recently, on May 15th, NOAA published the final rule to increase that commercial black sea bass quota for 2020. Next slide, please. So Virginia's total allocation for 2020 will be 1,116,000 pounds, which is an increase of 412,000 pounds from 2019. This breaks up into a directed fishery of 1,076,000 pounds and a bycatch fishery of 40,000 pounds. So this quota specification setting process happens yearly, where the Mid-Atlantic Council and the ASMFC establish a coastwide quota, and then NOAA sets and accepts the final rule. Virginia receives 20% of that coastwide commercial allocation. So what staff has done is actually remove the total quota poundage number and replace that with Virginia's percent allocation. And reason being that we believe that this should actually increase our regulatory efficiency, so we don't have to open this specific regulation yearly. and it makes it a lot more expedient for us to be able to tell our directed quota holders what their share is on a yearly basis without having to wait for a regulation to be opened. Next slide, please. So there are two pending actions that may actually in the future change Virginia's share of the coastwide commercial allocation. And we kind of just wanted to bring that to the commission's attention so that they know that these actions are taking place. We have many of our staff members sitting in and representing us on the writings of these various addendum and amendments. So the first is a pending addendum, and this is considering shifts in the geographic distribution of black sea bass. We know that the center of biomass is moving northward, and so there has been some call by northern states for a change to the commercial state-by-state allocation. Where that's at in the process right now is the council will be reviewing public comment from their scoping document this June. The public comment document will go to the ASMFC Management Board for approval in August of 2020, and then they expect final action December 2020 for implementation in 2021. We will, of course, keep the commission apprised of all of the goings-on with this pending addendum. The second action is a pending amendment. This is looking at the allocation between the commercial and the recreational sectors. And this is due to the fact of the impacts of the newly revised catch and landings data from an updated MREC calibration. Where that's at in the process is right now the board has reviewed public comment from their scoping hearing earlier this month. The options will be developed for the remainder of the year. And then public comment document will go to the board for its approval in December 2020 with some final action late 2021 for implementation in 2022. So, of course, we'll continue to keep the commission apprised of any changes to allocations with that. So, let's get into our regulation updates. Next slide, please. So you guys have seen this. It's been a while, so we're going to pop it back up again. But the Regulatory Review Committee has requested that when we open a regulation, that we kind of clean it up and make sure that there aren't any language changes that we should make to make the regulation easier to understand, easier to enforce, and not actually change the original intent of the regulation. So what you'll be seeing in the following slides are some regulatory changes in yellow, and then clarifying language changes are in brown. So these are not changes to intent in any way. So next slide. If you turn to your packet, your eval and your regulation, on the first page, you'll see an addition, which is a definition of annual quota. Annual quota will mean the Commonwealth's 20% share of the annual coastwide commercial black sea bass quota managed by the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission. So this was added so that we can add that 20% share directly to the regulation, making things clearer and more efficient. Next slide, please. So this is 4 VAC 20-950-47, commercial harvest quotas, and this is subdivision A. So the changes here are that we've added the language, the commercial black sea bass directed fishery quota shall be allocated 100% of the annual quota each year, except the commercial directed fishery quota shall not include the amount of the annual quota allocated to the commercial black sea bass bycatch fishery, which is specified in subsection B. When it has been announced by the Commission that the directed fishery quota has been projected as reached and the directed fishery quota has been closed, it shall be unlawful for any commercial black sea bass directed fishery permittee to possess aboard any vessel or land in Virginia any black sea bass. So these are some actual regulatory language changes and also some just updates to the language to make things a little bit more clear. Next slide, please. Okay, and this is subsection B underneath that same section 47, and these are just some language updates for clarification, which we added to the bycatch fishery section. I will read those into the record. The commercial black sea bass bycatch fishery shall be allocated 40,000 pounds of the annual quota each calendar year. When it has been announced that the bycatch fishery quota has been projected as reached and the bycatch fishery has been closed, it shall be unlawful for any commercial black sea bass bycatch fishery permittee to possess aboard any vessel or land in Virginia any black sea bass. In the event that the bycatch fishery quota is exceeded, the amount of the bycatch fishery quota overage shall be deducted from the following year's bycatch fishing quota. And next slide, please. So here we've just listed some different subsections that have changes added to them. Within them, we just added the terminology directed fishery to clarify between directed fishery quota and bycatch fishery quota. So I can draw your attention to section 46, subsection C, directed fishery and bycatch fishery permits. That's on page 4. Then section 48, both A and B, individual fishery quotas, bycatch limit at sea harvesters and exceptions. Those are on pages 5 and 6. And then 48.1B, 4 and C, individual transferable quotas. Those are on page 8. Again, you'll just see that language directed fishery added in there. And then last but not least, 48.2B, alternate vessel authorization requirements on page 8. Also addition of directed fishery language there. So to sum up, staff recommendation is that the commission amend Chapter 4 VAC 2950-10 pertaining to black sea bass to establish the commercial black sea bass fishery quota for 2020 using Virginia's percent allocation, which is 20% of the coastwide commercial black sea bass quota, to help make regulations more efficient. And with that, I will take any questions from the commissioner or associate commissioners. Hear anybody?
Any questions by members of the commission for Ms. Mattson? Okay. Hearing none, this is a public hearing. Does anyone in the public wish to be heard? If not, the chair will entertain a motion.
JJ Minor, I move that we approve staff recommendation.
Motion made by Mr. Minor to approve staff recommendations. Is there a second to the motion?
Second, Chad Ballard.
Second by Mr. Ballard. Further discussion? Mr. France, are you on? Yes. Mr. France? Mr. France, you need to unmute your phone, if you would, please.
Yeah. Hear me now?
I can, sir. How do you vote on the motion? You need to unmute again, please, sir. We have you now, Mr. France. How do you vote? Yes, sir. Mr. France, how do you vote?
I vote in favor. Vote yes.
Mr. France votes aye. Mr. Tankard?
Aye.
Mr. Zedrin?
Aye.
Dr. Neal?
Aye.
Mr. Ballard?
Aye.
Mr. Minor?
Aye.
Ms. Lusk?
Aye.
Ms. Everett?
Aye.
Chair votes aye. Motion passes unanimously. Thank you. The next item on the agenda is item 6, public hearing, proposal to amend Chapter 4 VAC 2510-10 pertaining to amberjack and cobia.
All right, can everybody hear me?
We can. Identify yourself, please.
This is Olivia.
Hey, Olivia.
Good morning.
Good morning. Proceed,
Okay,
please.
so, all right. This is a public hearing to amend Chapter 4 VAC 20-510-10 pertaining to amberjack and cobia, and Chapter 4 VAC 20-610-10 pertaining to commercial fishing and mandatory harvest reporting, to establish weekly harvest reporting and commercial fishery closure procedures for cobia, to comply with Amendment 1 of the Interstate Fisheries Management Plan for Atlantic Migratory Group cobia. Next slide. So in August 2019, the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission approved Amendment 1 of the Interstate Fisheries Management Plan for Atlantic Migratory Group cobia, which includes states from Georgia to New York. Among other things, Amendment 1 transitions responsibilities of monitoring and closing commercial harvest of cobia from the South Atlantic Fishery Management Council to ASMFC. It also enacts a mandatory weekly monitoring of commercial cobia landings by non-de minimis states, which Virginia is such a state. Next slide, please. Under this monitoring program, previous weekly landings will be used to set a commercial trigger. Any closure would occur at least 30 days after the landings trigger is reached. Once the commercial trigger is reached, all states will be notified by ASMFC of the closure date and will be required to close their commercial fisheries for the remainder of that year. Next slide, please. In previous years, Virginia initiated commercial cobia fishery closures once the fishery closure was announced in federal waters. However, due to our regulatory process, our closures didn't occur exactly when federal water closures occurred, which ultimately contributed to coastwide commercial quota overages, which you can see in this table. Next slide, please. Okay, a note about Addendum 1 to Amendment 1. The most recent CDAR 58 stock assessment found increased cobia population estimates due partly to changes in MRIP recreational estimates. This resulted in an increased total coastwide quota and changed the allocation dynamics between the commercial and recreational fisheries. Draft Addendum 1 in development and will propose alternative allocation strategies to address the changed allocation dynamics. But until then, and for the 2020 fishing year, Virginia and North Carolina have agreed to manage their commercial quotas jointly based on a 5-year average of the commercial landings between the two states. Virginia and North Carolina land about 90% of the commercial quota. Next slide, please. To identify the best method for mandatory weekly reporting, staff looked at 2019 landings data, found that 73 commercial licensees have harvested cobia last year. Most of those harvesters fish for cobia using hook and line, and about 25% of those harvesters already report online. Therefore, staff is proposing weekly online reporting for commercial cobia harvest. Next slide, please. The mandatory weekly reporting program will require reports of harvest from the previous Sunday to Saturday by the Wednesday of each week. And just a note here, North Carolina is collecting reports on this same schedule. Harvesters can report cobia online, but continue to report other species by mail if that is their preference. And staff would like to note that we understand this is a new program. some adjustments, and we will be lenient and provide education during the first year. For example, staff will contact harvesters directly if they submit a harvest by mail, and we will work with them to set up their online reporting accounts and answer any questions they may have. Next slide, please. Currently, commercial COBIA closures must go through Virginia's regulatory process. However, as I mentioned before, over the past 3 years, Virginia closed 1 month after federal waters closed, which contributed to coastwide quota overages. To avoid this, staff is proposing regulatory language that allows closure by notice or allows us to close administratively. Next slide, please. Should this regulation pass, we will reach out to let people know it's now mandatory. Because this issue was originally scheduled for the March Commission meeting, staff encouraged voluntary weekly reporting. Staff sent letters and emails to harvesters that had reported commercial COBIA harvest over the last 3 years, so anytime between 2017 and 2019. And staff clearly stated that the proposed regulatory changes for mandatory weekly reporting would go before the Commission as soon as Commission meetings could be held again. Next slide, please. So you already saw this information in the Black Sea Bass presentation, but just another reminder that I will be going through our proposed amendments for both Chapter 4 VAC 20-510-10 and 4 VAC 20-610-10. So we'll start with 610 next, or 510, sorry, next slide. Okay, in section 12, definitions, staff have added definitions for amberjack, COBIA, and mandatory harvest reporting program web application. Amberjack means any fish of the species Cerilio demerily, and COBIA means any fish of the species Recrecentron canatum. Mandatory harvest reporting program web application means the online web-based resource provided by the Commission to report commercial harvest of seafood, and the web address is included there. Next slide. Staff also included a definition for Virginia Saltwater Fishermen's Journal, which means the online web-based resource provided by the Commission to report recreational harvest of seafood, and the web address is also included there. Next slide, please. So in section 25, commercial fishery possession limits, season, and reporting requirements, staff added language describing the weekly online reporting requirements. In subsection B, any commercial harvest of COBIA shall only be reported through the online mandatory harvest reporting program web application. Such reports shall record daily harvests from Sunday through Saturday and be submitted on a weekly basis no later than Wednesday of the following week in accordance with 4 VAC 20-610. In subsection C, it shall be unlawful for any person to take, harvest, or possess any COBIA for commercial purposes once it has been announced by the Commission that the commercial quota has been landed for the current calendar year. Next slide, please. We also changed some language throughout the rest of 510 to increase clarity and efficiency. So we clarified the mandatory reporting requirements for the recreational COBIA permit, and that is found in Chapter 4 VAC 20-510-15, recreational COBIA permit and mandatory reporting. We also separated COBIA and amberjack into different subsections to increase clarity for each species. In Chapter 4 VAC 20-510-20, recreational fishery, possession limits, season, and vessel allowance, and Section 30, size limits. And then we reorganized and updated language for clarification and efficiency in Sections 33, 35, and 37. Next slide, please. Okay, so now getting into Chapter 4 VAC 20-610, we added 2 definitions in Section 20. one for COBIA, and then mandatory harvest reporting program web application again. Next slide, please. And staff also amended language in section 60, mandatory harvest reporting, to describe the weekly mandatory reporting for COBIA. In subsection E, staff specified that mandatory reporting is monthly, except as described in subsection F. And then in subsection F, staff detailed the weekly online reporting requirement for commercial COBIA. So subsection F reads, all reports of the commercial harvest of COBIA shall only be submitted through the online mandatory harvest reporting program web application. This report shall provide daily harvest records from Sunday through Saturday, as described in subsection G, and be submitted on a weekly basis no later than Wednesday of the following week. Next slide, please. There were other small language changes within section 60. Staff removed the word monthly from subsection G and subdivisions G 1, 2, and 3 because of the language change in subsection E. And the rest of the subsections in section 60 were reorganized or shifted to accommodate the addition of subsection F. Next slide, please. Staff recommends the Commission approve amendments to Chapter 4 VAC 20-510-10 pertaining to amberjack and cobia, and Chapter 4 VAC 20-610-10 pertaining to commercial fishing and mandatory harvest reporting, to establish weekly harvest reporting and commercial fishery closure procedures for cobia to comply with Amendment 1 of the Interstate Fisheries Management Plan for Atlantic Migratory Group cobia. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Are there any questions from Ms. Phillips by members of the commission?
This is Dr. Neal. I did have questions, but she answered them all. Well done.
I love it when that happens.
Yes. And I did catch
Great
a cobia yesterday, and it has been reported already. It was released with a tag.
Yeah, we knew you caught it. We're just going to wait to make sure you reported it.
I reported it, and it is released. Yeah, I have to make sure I do everything right.
Oh, good, sir. Any further questions for Olivia? Great job, Olivia. This is a public hearing. Are there any members of the public that wish to be heard on this matter? And if you are going to make any public comments, please use the chat bubble. They're seeing none. The matter is before the commission for action.
Move to accept staff recommendation. Dr. Neal.
Dr. Neal, motion made to accept staff recommendations. Is there a second to the motion?
Second.
Who was that, please?
Mr. Minor.
Thank you, Mr. Minor. Any further discussion? Mr. France? Mr. France? Yes, sir. How do you vote, please?
I accept staff recommendations.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Tankard?
Aye.
Thank you. Mr. Zedrin? Mr. Zedrin?
Yes.
Thank you. Dr. Neal?
Aye.
Mr. Ballard?
Aye.
Mr. Minor?
Aye.
Ms. Lusk?
Aye.
Ms. Everett?
Aye.
Chair votes aye. Motion passes unanimously. Thank you very much. The next item on the agenda is discussion, presentation of 2019-20 Blue Crab Winter Dredge Survey results and information pertaining to Virginia blue crab fisheries.
Good morning. This is Alexa Kretsch. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, Alexa, loud and clear.
All right. Good morning, Commissioner and members of the Commission. Today I'll be presenting the results of the 2019-2020 Baywide Blue Crab Winter Dredge Survey. Next slide, please. This survey is a cooperative effort between Maryland, DNR, and VIMS and has operated since 1990. Each state sends out a vessel that conducts dredge tows across the bay from December through March. They then combine these data to assess a bay-wide abundance, including size and sex-specific estimates. The survey also puts together harvests from each bay jurisdiction with abundances to estimate exploitation of the blue crab population. These results are an important tool for managers who have used abundance and exploitation levels to determine what or if management action is needed. These results have been reviewed by the Chesapeake Bay Stock Assessment Committee and a cohesive management approach discussed by Virginia, Maryland, and Potomac River. The result of this is a press release coordinated between the jurisdictions, which was released on May 20th and can be found in Attachment 3 of your evaluation. The following data were also presented to the Crab Management Advisory Committee at their May 21st meeting. Next slide. All abundance estimates decreased from 2019, but for the most part are still higher than they were in 2018. Total crab abundance decreased by 1/3. Female abundance is over the 70 million crab threshold, but is still below the 215 million crab target. The biggest thing driving the total abundance down was a 42% drop in juvenile abundance, making 2020's juvenile value rank 19 out of the 31 years of the survey. One good thing is that overwintering mortality is the lowest the survey has seen, less than 1% in each category. Next slide. Here are the total abundances of all sizes and sexes in the bay. You can see the drop from 2019 to 2020. 2020 was below the long-term average and the average since the 2008 measures were introduced, but seems to be within the normal variability since 2015. Next slide. This is the abundance of juveniles, which was also below the average of both time periods. And as I said, there was a drop of 43% from 2019. Next slide. This is the abundance of both male and female adults. It did decline, but it remained over the long and short-term averages. Next slide. This is the control rule that dictates a healthy range for the population. We're not at the 215 million crab target, but we're still well above the 70 million crab threshold. Next slide. I'll now be presenting the bay-wide harvest. Next slide. This is total harvest in the bay, not including seaside areas, which totaled 61 million pounds across Virginia, Maryland, and the Potomac River. Note that the blue bars are Virginia harvest, the red is Maryland, and the yellow is from the Potomac River. The bay-wide harvest was 10% higher in 2019 than in 2018. 2019 is right at the long-term mean and is above the post-2008 mean. Next slide. For the 11th year in a row, the bay fished below the female exploitation target of 25.5% and the 34% threshold. The female exploitation rate in 2019 was 17%, and this defines the exploitation rate, which is the percentage of crabs in a year in the population removed by harvest. Next slide. The male exploitation rate of 18% was also below the conservation trigger. It's interesting that both the male and female exploitation rates were lower this year than last year, considering the total harvest increased. This is because of the higher abundances we saw in 2019. Also keep in mind there is uncertainty on both sides of this equation, with how many crabs we caught and how many there were in the bay. This is why the jurisdictions use precaution in managing harvest. Next slide. The next two graphs show what percent of female and male crabs harvested from the bay in 2019 were caught by each jurisdiction. In 2018, Maryland harvested a similar number of females as Virginia did, but last year, Virginia returned to catching 2/3 of the females. Next slide. The trend in male crabs, where Maryland typically takes 60 to 70%, remained the same again last year. Next slide. I included this graph because it shows the interesting trend where juvenile abundance tracks quite closely with the bay-wide harvest. This likely represents how the juveniles in a winter survey mature into the harvestable population that year. Next slide. Now on to Virginia-specific harvest information. Keep in mind, all these data remain preliminary at this time. Bay-wide harvest had increased 10% in 2019, but Virginia's harvests, including the seaside areas, increased by 22%. The distribution by gear is similar to previous years. Dockside value was over $34 million. 878 individuals reported harvest over 65,000 trips. Next slide. The blue bars here represent commercial harvest in millions of pounds, while the orange line shows the dockside value in millions of dollars, adjusted to the 2019 value. 2019 actually had the third highest value since 2001. Next slide. This graph tracks the eligibility, sales, and use of crab pot licenses. About 65% of eligible licensees reported harvest, which has been steady for the last few years. This leaves latent effort, or people who are eligible for a license and choose not to use it, at 35%. It looks like most latent effort is in the 85 pot license category, where only half of eligible licensees reported activity in 2019. Next slide. This graph shows harvest days, or how many days out of the season crabbers reported activity. For example, 66 people, or 8% of all active crabbers, reported working between 1 and 10 days. The most days fished by any crabber was 216, which is impressive when you consider there are 222 allowed days in the season, excluding Sundays. Next slide. Here's harvest by crab pot over time. You can see the 2019 increase from 2018, and is also above the long-term average and the average since the 2008 measures were put in place. Next slide. This also shows harvest by crab pot with the number of trips overlaid. You can see that our crabbers took about 4,000 more trips in 2019 than they did in 2018. Next slide. Crab pot harvest by month follows the average trend, with peaks in April and again in July and August. The biggest difference from 2018 was in spring. March increased from 70,000 to 500,000 pounds, and April increased from 1.7 million to 4.7 million pounds. Next slide. Harvest by peeler pots is a lot less variability than crab pots, and 2019 is right at the average since 2009. Next slide. Peeler pot trips have decreased for the 4th year in a row, though harvest has been somewhat stable. Next slide. Staff recommends this information be used as guidance for any regulatory changes to Virginia's blue crab fishery that may be considered for advertisement by the Commission for its June public hearing. And with that, I can take any questions.
Thank you, Alexa. Any members of the commission have any questions for Alexa? I think it shows that things appear to be relatively stable and the management practices that we have in place are working. Any questions?
This is Christy Everett. I had a question.
Yes, ma'am. Ms. Everett, proceed.
Yeah. So I think it was mentioned that the juvenile abundance has decreased to 42%. Does that indicate for the 2021 survey, next winter's survey, we should see also either similar decline or increased decline, if that's an indicator of future year?
Alexa?
The blue crab population is more like an annual crop than the species we usually handle, where you see the effects carried through. So we can have juvenile abundance be high one year and low the next, as we just saw, even though there should be more spawning members of the population. It often depends on weather, temperature, predators, things that we can't really affect.
Do you have a follow-up, Ms. Everett?
No, thank you very much. It's helpful. Appreciate it.
Thank you, ma'am. Further questions? Alexa, thank you for the comprehensive overview. We really, really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Next item on the agenda is item number 8, Bevins Oyster Company and Calvert Seafood Corporation, Oyster Planting Ground Application 2017136. Mr. Stagg, are you handling that, sir?
I am.
Proceed, please.
This is Ben Stagg, the Director of Shellfish Aquaculture Leasing and Mapping for the Engineering Surveying Department. For the record, virtual good morning.
Yeah, Mr. Stagg, recognizing your voice, do solemnly swear the testimony that you're about to give in this matter will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God.
I do.
Thank you, ma'am. Mr. Stagg, please proceed.
Virtual good morning to all. So this is a oyster planting ground application in the name of Bevins Oyster Company Incorporated and Calvert Seafood Corporation, requesting to lease approximately 1 acre of ground in the Great Wicomico River in Northumberland County. The application has been protested by an adjacent highland property owner. Next slide. So again, this is located in Northumberland County in the Great Wicomico River. The arrow depicts the point of land where the protestant lives, and the application area is on the western side of that point. Next slide. A little closer view, this point is known as Rogue Point. The protestant, I believe's house is on the eastern side of the point. The application is on the western, starts at the tip of the point and goes along the shoreline on the western side. There is another application to the south that's not part of this current application. Next slide. This application was subjected to our normal public interest review. A few items to note about the application. This is the map that depicts the SAV areas in this location. There is some slight SAV in the most offshore portion of this application and a considerable amount in the existing lease that's already there. But we did view butting this up to the existing lease, which I'll discuss a little more in a moment, would have a minimal impact on SAV in this new application area. Again, here the application is shown in red. You'll note a very narrow area that extends up to the point and wraps around the point slightly. We deleted some portions of that during the survey, believing they were intertidal and not subtidal, but we did include a portion of that narrow area in the original survey. We did receive a protest from the property owner, Reverend Steinberg, and I'm going to read her letter into the record, just so it's on record. It is on page 21 in your packet. We received her letter in December of 2017, and her letter states, "Dear Mr. Stagg, I'm responding to your communication of November 28th concerning the application 2017-136 with the lease of 1 acre of on the Great Wicomico River for private oyster grounds. As the owner of property within 200 feet, I wish to protest the application. We do notify landowners within 200 feet. I'm concerned about the significant increase in the number of commercial operators and the scope of their beds in this very small area of the Great Wicomico. It is generally accepted that hand scrapes and dredges do indeed harm oyster beds, including reefs. In fact, James Wesson, former VMRC Chief of Oyster Conservation and Replenishment, has noted that, quote, motorized gear does have a detrimental effect. It's pretty clear that working the bottoms hurt. It does not help, unquote. That was from the Bay Journal, November of 2016. I suspect that such harvesting, especially over-harvesting of immature oysters for relocation elsewhere, also has a negative impact on bottom culture. Has there been any study of the impact of high-volume gear operated harvesting on the blue crab population? By report of area long-time sports anglers, the specific area for which this application is applying has a large presence of juvenile striped bass. could motorized modern harvesting here be a threat to a species that only recently has made a comeback in the bay? While I have no scientific data, I offer my anecdotal observation that since the onset of so much harvesting by motor-powered hand scrapes in the immediate area, there has been a massive increase in the volume of broken glass, obviously quite aged and long buried, from an era when household trash was routinely thrown into the river, washing onto shoreline of my property. As well, an inlet to a tidal pond has experienced increased silting, threatening the viability of the pond. While B following A might not always indicate cause and effect, I suspect there are some connections in these developments. I am not a foe of commercial fishing / oystering. However, I do believe there must be a healthy balance between appropriately regulated commercial activity and the environmental stability of our rivers and the entire Chesapeake Bay into which they flow. I have lived on the special shore of the Great Wicomico for over 50 years, and I'm concerned that the health of this river be of the highest priority. For these reasons, I protest granting application 2017-136. At the time the evaluation was written, we had recontacted the protestant and indicated that we had removed the narrow section along the shoreline in a revised plat and are only proposing to lease the more rectangular, larger area along the western shore that's south of the point. We were in hopes that maybe that would allay the protestant's concerns. She did respond over the weekend by email and indicated she still objects for the same reasons, resubmitted the letter I read into the record again, and kind of reiterated those concerns in her email. Having said that, the applicant's agent, Mr. A.J. Erskine, did reach out to Ms. Thalberg and gave a more detailed explanation of the proposed uses of this lease and adjacent leases offshore. He also attempted to address her concerns in a letter he wrote to her after her protest. Next slide, please. Again, this is just a record of the protest we received from Ms. Thalberg. Next slide. I do want to note here that Bevan's Oyster Company does, and Coward Seafood do have the 3 leases shown here in the circle. The subsequent plat you'll see will list the northern one is still in the name of Booth, but that was transferred to Bevan's at the beginning of this year, and that will be corrected on the final plat. That said, Mr. Erskine did say in his letter and in my conversations with Bevan's Oyster Company and Coward Seafood, they have indicated they'd like to combine these 3 leases together and include this new area if approved. We have not done the combination pending a hearing on this lease application to see if it's approved or not. So I will show you a plat in a second that will show just the area we're proposing as leasable for this application, but the final plat will likely reflect a merging of all these leases should you approve this additional area. Next slide. So again, this was the original survey after deleting a slight portion right at the point that we did not believe was subtitled. It did include those corners 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That narrow area, however, after talking to the applicant and listening to the protestant's concerns, we decided to delete that area. As you can see here, that area has been taken back out, and now the survey goes from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and back to 1, from 0.57 acres to about 0.48 acres. Staff does understand that the proposed leasing of areas immediately adjacent to upland properties often results in concerns raised by this landowner. Staff has attempted to address the protestant's concern to the greatest extent possible by removing some of the areas originally requested. Additionally, staff is not aware of any scientific data that would support the suggestion that propagation and harvest of shellfish has an adverse impact on localized crab or fish populations. Therefore, after reviewing the protestant's objections and considering all the factors in 28.2607 and 28.1205A of the Code of Virginia, we do recommend leasing .48 acres of grounds to Bevins Oyster Company Incorporated and Tower Seafood. I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Stagg. Do any members of the commission have any questions of Mr. Stagg?
Commissioner Bowman,
Yes,
Trustee Everett.
Chad Ballard does.
I have Ms. Everett and then Mr. Ballard. Ms. Everett?
Thank you. The .48 acres, is that reflect area that originally proposed had the SAV in it, or how does that shake out in terms of the revised proposal?
So from corner 1 to 5, there is a slight encroachment of SAV towards the shore. It's fairly minimal. Most of the SAV here is on existing plat file 1774. It's just offshore. While we don't encourage it, existing leases are allowed to dredge, even if there's SAV. We do try to avoid leasing new areas where there's SAV, but about 85% of this area being proposed does not have SAV.
Further questions, Ms. Everett?
No, I guess I just a small follow-up. What, I know you said it's probably only like 15%, but what is it? Is it widgeon, or curious if it's high quality or very minimal? Okay. Thank you. That's it for me. Appreciate it.
Well, my guess, no matter what it is at this location and that area where it's transitioning, where it won't grow, the quality is getting less valuable because it's probably the water depth just won't support it. It's too shallow. It's probably too hot in the summertime.
Mr. Ballard?
Thank you.
I guess I'm curious on the revising of the application and what the purpose of that specifically was, because it seems to me like the protestants' concerns were about the activity and the health of the river, not so much normal viewshed concerns. And I guess I was curious what purpose the revision actually served, and why that area was eliminated.
Mr. Stagg?
Sure. We discussed that with Mr. Erskine, who represents the two companies that applied. They were agreeable. That my understanding was the reason they applied for this area, including that very narrow area, was to consolidate these leases and avoid someone else coming in and applying for this narrow area inside their lease, which they had some concerns about, might conflict with their use of the lease. So it was my understanding of more kind of a housekeeping to just take up the little area that was left. I don't think they were too concerned about that narrow area because it is so narrow and so shallow that it would probably be difficult to dredge it. That is what they're proposing to do on this lease and what they have been doing on the offshore leases historically. So they were amenable in hopes that that would help allay some of the concerns of the protestant. The protestant's house is on the other side of the property, but they do own, down to the water on both sides. So hopefully that answers your question. But to further answer, these 3 leases that Bevins has and the 2 leases to the west and east that are in the name of Harding all have mandatory reporting of considerable amount of harvest of oysters over the last 10 years.
Further questions, Mr. Ballard?
No, thank you.
Any other member of the commission have a question for Mr. Stagg? Okay, this is a public hearing. Does anyone wish to be heard in support of this? If you do, please use the chat box and indicate your desire to be heard. Seeing none, is there anyone in opposition? I have a Isabel Stylberg who has indicated through letter opposition. Ms. Stylberg, are you on?
I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am. Loud and clear. Please proceed.
I am of my original opinion on this, and I am not opposed to oyster harvesting and this new life that is the Great Wicomico is able to provide. I am just concerned about the concentration of it in a very small area from Barrett's Creek to Mila and Penny Creek. And that is my concern. I think there needs to be a healthy balance between the farming and sort of the natural state of the river. I am a little confused and wish you would explain to me further if Bevins and Cowart have dropped their original request. I can't quite get that from the plat and from your explanation.
Mr. Stagg, could you respond to that, please?
Yes. If we can go back on the slide presentation, maybe 4 slides or so, that'll help me explain. Keep going. That one will be fine. So, Ms. Dahlberg, the original application did start about at the bottom of that circle where you see Bevins Oyster Company written out, and then went up the shoreline and did wrap around the shoreline slightly about to the corner of plat file 17781. So that is the original area that they asked for. We did determine once you got to the point that it was not subtitle, so we eliminated that. We did include that some of that narrow strip along the western shore originally when we surveyed it. In conversations with the applicant and their agent, we felt that maybe perhaps it would be better to just eliminate that because it was so shallow. They agreed to that. So what was left is just that sort of rectangular area that you see in the plat. So if we go back to the plat, the final slide, show that plat. So
okay,
that was part of the area they did originally ask for.
Yes, that's not, yeah, that's less than what they originally asked for. So it doesn't really extend to the point.
Right, but now it won't extend all the way to the point that, but they have an existing lease that comes very close to the point already. But that's already an existing lease. Okay.
Well, I still make my point. If you, Mr. Stagg, and the members of your commission, I will leave it to you all to decide what is the best thing to do. And I appreciate your interest and your concern and your response to me. You've been very, very responsive, and I will wait for your decision.
Thank you, Ms. Stylberg. We appreciate your participation in these very difficult times. We really, really do. Did Mr. Erskine wish to be heard?
Yep, I'm going to unmute him right now.
Okay. Mr. Erskine, would you like to, realizing we've already gone through the support, we're in the opposition, but you're speaking in support of the project, correct?
Yes, sir.
Would you proceed, please?
Yes, sir, Mr. Commissioner, members of the commission, I appreciate your time. We wish to be good stewards of this area. It's highly productive, as Mr. Stagg indicated. We've tried to work through this process, but we don't want to go in and have somebody else lease a very narrow area inside of our existing lease. That was the purpose behind this. This is all on bottom oyster culture. We do remove the seed oysters. This is a seed oyster area. We replace shells every year. So we do believe we are being good stewards of the river. We appreciate your favorable recommendation. Thank you.
Thank you. I should have asked, did any member of the commission have a question for Ms. Stylberg? Did any member of the commission have a question for Mr. Erskine? Does any member of the commission have any further questions for Mr. Stagg? Seeing none or hearing none, the matter is before the commission.
James Minor, I move that we approve staff recommendations.
Motion made by Mr. Minor to approve staff recommendations. Is there a second?
I'll second. This is Dr. Neal.
Dr. Neal seconds. Any further discussion by members of the commission?
I have a comment.
Oh, yes, sir.
Just that was one of the nicest protestants I think we've heard from.
totally agree with you there, Mr. Zedrin, and I know you have heard a number of different folks during the course of your work. I could not agree anymore. We appreciate that. Further discussion. Mr. France? Mr. France?
Yes, can you hear me?
And now, how do you vote, sir? Mr. France?
Hear me now? Yes, aye.
I can, sir, yes. How do you vote? Aye. Mr. Tankard?
Aye.
Mr. Zedrin? Dr. Neal?
Aye.
Mr. Ballard?
Aye.
Mr. Minor?
Aye.
Ms. Lusk?
Aye.
Ms. Everett?
Everett seems to have disconnected. Cheers. Try her again.
Ms. Everett, how do you vote on the motion?
Aye.
Chair votes aye. Motion passes unanimously. Thanks to everyone for their participation. Again, in this difficult times, we understand how troublesome and cumbersome this can be, so we really do appreciate your participation. We thank you very, very much. The next item on the agenda is Hampton Roads Connector Partners, JV, number 19-1577. Who's handling this?
Good morning. This is Allison Lay.
Ms. Lay, recognizing your voice, do you solemnly swear the testimony that you give today will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Thank you, ma'am. Proceed, please.
All right, so we're going to go over the application from the Hampton Roads Connectors Partners requesting authorization to widen I-64 over approximately 10 miles from Settlers Landing Road in Hampton to the I-64, I-564 interchange in Norfolk, to include the expansion of existing roadways, construction of new bridge trestles, boring of 2 new 2-lane tunnels, expansion of existing portal islands, and development of a construction staging area on Willoughby Spit. Next slide. This is an aerial view of the project area. Construction will occur in both Hampton and in Norfolk. Next slide. The project area starts at Settlers Landing Road in Hampton and continues south to the I-64, I-564 interchange in Norfolk. For this presentation, I'm going to focus on the aspects of the project that are in VMRC's jurisdiction. Next slide. First, I will go over the project construction and impacts starting on the north side of the project and then moving south. The first section of the project is the North Trestle Bridges. Next slide. This drawing shows the construction impacts from the North Trestle Bridges. The existing North Trestle Bridges will be removed and replaced by 2 new 4-lane structures. Work trestles, which are shown in yellow, and jump trestles, shown in green, as well as barges, will be used to construct the new trestle bridges. A persistent SAV bed, which is shown in light green shading, will be impacted by construction. There will be 16 square feet of permanent impacts from a piling, as well as 20,800 square feet of temporary shading impacts from the work trestles. Next slide. These are cross-section drawings showing the North Trestle Bridges from Hampton to the North Island. Temporary sheet piles will be installed at the north shoreline to support excavation and construction of the North Shore abutment. The new trestle bridges will have a maximum clearance of about 25 feet above mean low water. Next slide. Each of the 2 new trestle bridges will have a 12-foot shoulder, 3 12-foot lanes, and a 16-foot shoulder/part-time hot lane or high occupancy toll lane. Next slide. This drawing shows a continuation of the North Trestle Bridges to where they will meet the North Island, which will need to be expanded to accommodate construction of the new tunnels. Next slide. This brings us to the next section of the project, which is the North Island. Next slide. The North Island will be expanded by 15.84 acres to the west. The area of the island expansion will first be dredged to remove material that is unsuitable to support the fill of the island. Dredging will occur to a depth of approximately 32.5 feet below mean low water and will result in 112,225 cubic yards of material being removed. Additionally, a shape array will be dredged so that settlement rates of the island expansion can be determined. This will result in an additional 2.08 acres and 20,101 cubic yards of material being removed. Additionally, 80 temporary mooring pilings will be placed along the perimeter of the island expansion to assist with construction. Next slide. Construction of the island will start with the construction of a bund, which is shown in the red shading, around the perimeter of the island expansion area. Then fill, which is shown in yellow, will start to be placed inside of the bund. Then the edge of the island expansion will be armored with riprap, shown in orange. The finished island expansion will be at an elevation of 12 feet and will meet the existing island. Construction of the island will occur from barges that are moored along the outer edge of the island expansion area. Next slide. The next section of the project is the tunnels. The top image shows the location of the new tunnels relative to the existing tunnels. The new tunnels will carry eastbound traffic and the existing tunnels will carry westbound traffic. The bottom image is a representation of the tunnel boring machine that will be used during construction of the tunnels. Two tunnels with an internal diameter of 41.5 feet and a length of 7,900 feet will be bored with the tunnel boring machine. The tunnel boring machine will start at the South Island, bore the first tunnel, then turn around at the North Island and bore the second tunnel. When the tunnel boring machine returns to the South Island, it will be disassembled and removed. Then road construction and finishing work will occur within the tunnels. Next slide. In the main channel, the tunnels will be under 55 feet of water and 60 feet of sediment. Material bored from the tunnels will be amended with bentonite and pumped to a separation and treatment plant located on the South Island. The material will be dewatered and the filtrate will go through the water treatment plant and be discharged through a permitted discharge pipe. The solid material will be transported via conveyor to barges for disposal at approved facilities. Next slide. The new tunnels, which are shown on the right on both of these images, will be deeper than the existing tunnels to accommodate for future deepening of the main channel. Next slide. The next section of the project is the South Island. Several work trestles will be constructed near the South Island to accommodate construction activities. Next slide. The first work trestle that will be constructed is on the north side of the island. This work trestle will be used to conduct jet grouting where the new tunnels will be bored. Next slide. Jet grouting is a process used to stabilize and consolidate sediment and is necessary for the tunnel boring machine to bore in this area. These images show how jet grouting will occur. The image on the left shows a machine that will be positioned on the work trestles, and then jet grouting will occur in the sediment below, as shown in the right image. A steel casing will be used to prevent jet grout residual from getting into the waterway. Next slide. Two work platforms will be constructed on the west side of the South Island. One will be used to receive and construct the tunnel boring machine, the one on the right, and then the other one will be a conveyor for the bored material to be placed on barges for transport to approved disposal site, and that one is on the left. Next slide. The South Island will be expanded by 4.04 acres to the south. And this is necessary to accommodate the transition between the south trestle abutment and the tunnel approach structure. The construction process will be similar as with the North Island expansion. Next slide, please. The expansion area will have a combination of dredging and settlement reduction piles placed to prepare it to be filled. Settlement reduction piles will be driven up to 95 feet below grade. and dredging will range from 3 feet to 8 feet deep, depending on results from geotechnical borings that are currently being analyzed. Next slide. The next section of the project is the South Trestle Bridges from the South Island to Norfolk. Next slide. The existing South Trestle Bridges will be demolished and replaced with a single 8-lane trestle bridge. Temporary maintenance of traffic trestles will be constructed to maintain traffic flow during construction. Dredging will also occur to allow for construction access for barges. Next slide. Approximately 19,550 cubic yards of submerged bottom will be dredged to a depth of -6 feet mean low water in the South Trestle area for construction access. This dredging will remove high spots that have formed by sand movement over time. Next slide. This image shows an additional 33,957 cubic yards of submerged land that will be dredged for access during demolition of the 2 existing bridge trestles. Again, this is just to remove sediment that has accumulated from sand movement. Next slide. Work trestles will also be used for construction in areas of the South Trestle Bridges that are inaccessible by barges, such as near the shoreline. Next slide. These cross-section drawings for the South Trestles are similar to those for the North Trestle. The shorelines will also have the similar abutment work completed. Next slide. This transverse section is also similar to the North Trestle Bridges, but will be a single 8-lane structure instead of the 2 4-lane structures as on the North Trestle Bridges. Next slide. The next section of the project is the Willoughby Bay area. Next slide. The Willoughby Spit area will be developed to be a laydown area and a base for marine operations. Approximately 961 linear feet of bulkhead will be replaced. 3 20-foot wide by 100-foot long timber piers will be constructed to provide access for crew boats. An existing concrete pier and spud barge will be used for tug berthing, and a 59-foot wide by 330-foot long concrete pier will be constructed for barge access. Next slide. This is a cross-section drawing showing the bulkhead and timber piers that will be constructed. The new bulkhead will be placed 1.5 feet in front of the existing bulkhead. The bulkhead will be at an elevation of approximately 5.5 feet above mean low water, and the new piers will extend from there. Next slide. The remainder of the work on Willoughby Spit will be upland work to facilitate construction. The project then continues toward the Willoughby Bay Trestle Bridges. Next slide. The existing trestle bridges over Willoughby Bay will be expanded to the north and to the south. Next slide. A combination of jump trestles, which are shown in green, and the existing bridge trestles will be used to widen the existing trestle bridges. Next slide. The channel underneath the existing trestle bridge is marked on this drawing with a red arrow. This channel will remain open during construction. Boat traffic will be directed around construction activities accordingly. Next slide. These are cross-section drawings of the Willoughby Bay Trestle Bridges. The new trestle bridge will maintain the clearance of 25 feet above mean high water in the area where the channel passes under the bridge. Next slide. This drawing shows the existing trestle bridges and the expansions to the outside of both the westbound and eastbound lanes. The new sections are highlighted in yellow on this image. The proposed westbound lanes are on the left and the proposed eastbound lanes are on the right. Each trestle bridge will have a 12-foot wide shoulder, 3 12-foot wide lanes, and a 14-foot wide shoulder/part-time hot lane. Next slide. This drawing shows where the Willoughby Bay Trestle Bridge makes landfall. This will start a period of upland roadway construction until we get to the Mason Creek bridges. Next slide. This drawing shows the first crossing of Mason Creek. The existing bridges over Mason Creek will be expanded to the outside of both structures. The construction process will be similar to that of the Willoughby Bay trestle bridges. Next slide. This drawing shows the second crossing of Mason Creek. On this image, you can see that jump trestles and work trestles will also be used to widen the bridges over Mason Creek. Next slide. In addition to the roadway construction, there will be 3 areas that will be used as mooring areas and as safe harbor areas. These areas will be in Phoebus, Hampton Flats, and Willoughby Bay. Next slide. The Phoebus area will be a safe harbor area and will only be used during severe weather. It will not be used as a typical mooring area. The area will be marked at each corner with buoys and will be located outside of the Phoebus Channel. Next slide. The Hampton Flats area will be used as a mooring area. The area will be marked and will have 6 to 8 mooring buoys located within it for barges to moor to when they are not being used for construction. Next slide. These drawings show the type of mooring buoys that will be used. Each mooring buoy will have a minimum breaking strength of 280,000 pounds. The applicant is prepared to respond if any barges or vessels should break away from their moorings. Next slide. The Willoughby Bay area will be used as a mooring area and as a safe harbor area. Lighted buoys will be used to mark the area every 200 feet around the perimeter. There will also be a line of 26 mooring pilings for barges to moor to that will be marked and lit according to Coast Guard standards. Next slide. These images are examples of what the area might look like when in use by various construction barges. The Willoughby Bay Channel will remain open during construction for residential boat access. The applicant has a plan to make the public aware of areas that need to be avoided while maintaining access to all piers throughout construction. Next slide. In addition to the mooring and safe harbor areas, the applicant is requesting the relocation of the Hampton Creek Approach Channel to aid in construction of the North Island expansion. The red lines on this image show the existing channel, and the blue lines show the proposed alteration. The channel markers will have to be moved, but no dredging will be required for this alteration because the depth in the proposed channel area is still deep enough to allow for navigation throughout the channel. The applicant has been coordinating with the Coast Guard to make these changes. Next slide. Waste material generated from the project will be disposed of at several sites. Concrete from the demolition of old trestle bridges will be placed on artificial reefs in accordance with a plan developed with the VMRC Artificial Reef Program. Suitable sandy dredge material will be placed on public beaches where deemed appropriate. The applicant is currently working with the City of Norfolk and the City of Hampton to determine if material is acceptable for placement on city beaches. All material that cannot be used beneficially will be disposed of at an approved upland disposal site. The 2 disposal sites chosen are Port Tobacco at Shirley Plantation in Charles City and Dominion Recycling Center in Chesapeake. Materials will most often be barged when possible, but trucks will be used at times when barging is not possible. Next slide. Geotechnical borings that were previously permitted are currently being conducted around the existing bridge tunnel. Construction will start as soon as all permits are received, and the project is planned to be completed by November 2025. Multiple areas throughout the project will have construction occurring at the same time. So this summarizes the impacts from construction, and now I will discuss comments that we have received about this project. Next slide. During our public interest review, we received comments from several agencies, adjacent property owners, and the public. First, I will go over the VIMS comments. VIMS provided comments related to several aspects of the project. Prior to the submittal of the application, VDOT contracted with VIMS to run a hydrodynamic model to accurately assess the project's potential adverse impacts to local hydrology and aquatic resources. The results of the hydrodynamic modeling study indicate that the proposed project will have no or only minimal effects, thus eliminating VMS's preliminary concerns regarding hydrologic changes. VMS also advised that impacts to the persistent bed of SAV located along the Hampton shoreline should be restored by seeding upon project completion. Hard clam densities were found to be low and the habitat quality poor. Therefore, it was determined no mitigation was needed for this species. In VM's opinion, project impacts to vegetated tidal wetlands were appropriately mitigated for with the purchase of credits from a tidal wetlands bank. VMS additionally recommended that riprap be used at Willoughby Spit instead of the proposed bulkhead. VMS expressed concerns about the potential for mortality and injury to finfish associated with noise from driving hollow steel pilings. They recommend ramp-up procedures, cushion blocks, and bubble curtains with isolation casings be used for all impact driving of steel hollow pilings. They additionally recommended an in-stream work time of year restriction for the installation of steel hollow piles from February 15 through June 30th to be most protective, or from February 15th to April 30th if the larger window resulted in unacceptable project delays. Lastly, they recommended an acoustic study be done to provide information on noise impacts to fish and effectiveness of mitigation measures. Next slide. NOAA Fisheries also made several comments on the project, as well as providing a list of recommendations. Several of their recommendations included mitigation and best management practices that were proposed in the application, such as purchase of mitigation credits, internal jetting of concrete piles, best management practices for dredging, and sound attenuation. Additionally, recommendations were made to restore the SAV impacted during construction, restoration of the bulkhead at Willoughby Spit to a living shoreline post-construction, and an acoustic sampling and monitoring plan in lieu of the proposed bubble curtains in water 20 feet or deeper. Next slide. In response to the public notice, several nearby property owners voiced their concerns about impacts from the project. Although we only received one protest, 7 other property owners had questions that they wanted the applicant to address. These questions related to sound walls, property values, distance of construction to properties and piers in Willoughby Bay, and disturbances to foliage. The protest that we received was from Mr. Steve Quinley, who raised concerns about a decrease in his property value and an increase in noise pollution. Next slide. In addition to concerns from the adjacent property owners, we also received 2 public comments from Dan Beeker, the president of the Virginia Society of Ornithology, and Dr. James Frazier, a professor at Virginia Tech. These comments relate to the displacement of colonial nesting waterbirds that utilized the South Island. Dr. Frazier was a co-author on a report that was completed by Virginia Tech in 2018 that analyzed the bird species currently utilizing the South Island and provided recommendations to VDOT for how to reduce impacts to these species that would result from construction. The report evaluated several conservation measures and came to a final recommendation that an island should be created before the start of construction. Both Dr. Frazier and Mr. Beeker are requesting that our permit authorize the creation of an island for the birds. Next slide. In response to the comments received from agencies and individuals, staff requested further mitigation from the applicant. The final mitigation package provided consists of several parts. The first is purchase of credits from banks to comply with the Army Corps of Engineers requirements. 1.03 non-tidal wetland credits will be purchased from Lewis Farm Mitigation Bank. 2.7 tidal wetland credits will be purchased from New Mill Creek Mitigation Bank. And 0.49 oyster reef credits, as well as 14.59 subaqueous credits will be purchased from the Elizabeth River Project's Living River Restoration Trust. Next slide. In addition to the mitigation credits that will be purchased, the applicant has also proposed to mitigate for SAV in response to comments from both VMS and NOAA. The applicant will fund SAV restoration that will be conducted by VMS. This will consist of seeding and monitoring the 20,816 square foot area that will be impacted from temporary shading and the driving of a single piling next to the North Trestle bridges. The applicant has agreed to pay $25 per square foot to restore the area of impact. Next slide. An acoustic study has also been proposed by the applicant to mitigate for impacts to both anadromous and resident fishes. This is in response to both VMS and NOAA comments, and to mitigate for not using bubble curtains on all steel hollow pilings and not adhering to the time of year recommendation by VMS. The acoustic study will have two components, an anthropogenic noise monitoring study and a fish response study. Both studies will be run simultaneously to provide data that can be used in making future regulatory decisions regarding impacts to fish from underwater noise generated during pile driving. The anthropogenic sound study will consist of measuring underwater sound during pile driving. The fishery sound effect study will record the presence, density, behavior, and distribution of migratory and resident fishes. The use of remote sensing tools such as side scan sonar, biosonics hydroacoustic, and DITSON or ARIS sonar will be used. Next slide. A fish passage study has also been proposed to further mitigate for impacts to anadromous fishes. This study will use habitat and biological assessments at previously documented migration impediments in the lower James River Basin to establish a prioritized list of high-value streams and locations for future fish passage projects. The applicant will additionally contribute $100,000 towards these fish passage projects and may include fish stocking if it is determined to be useful in reestablishing the use of rivers for anadromous fishes. Next slide. In addition to the mitigation studies, the applicant has also proposed to use bubble curtains for hollow steel piles that will be impact driven in waters that are 20 feet deep or greater to reduce acoustic impacts. This image shows the areas where piles will have bubble curtains used. The two main areas where they will be used are the jet grouting trestle closest to the main channel, and for the sediment reduction pilings in the footprint of the South Island expansion, as well as another work trestle near that area. Next slide. Bubble curtains will be enclosed by a geotextile curtain material and will have multiple bubble rings. They will be attached to the pile driving templates and will be in the raised position while the template is moved into place and while piles are being vibrated. Before an impact hammer is used to drive piles, the bubble curtains will be lowered and air will be pumped through them to reduce hydroacoustic effects. Next slide, please. To address concerns from adjacent property owners, the applicant has provided them with information on impacts from the project that are closest to their properties. It has been determined that the Willoughby Bay Bridge expansion will overlap at least two existing piers. Our permit does not grant the authority to encroach upon the property rights, including riparian rights of others. The applicant is currently working on a plan to legally obtain the area needed for the construction of the project. To address concerns about the impact to colonial nesting birds on South Island, a bird plan has been developed by the applicant. The state-listed endangered gold-billed tern is addressed in this plan. Additionally, in accordance with the governor's initiative, a separate application submitted by DGIF has been permitted to allow the installation of barges to further address impacts to birds by creating suitable habitat to replace what will be lost during construction on South Island. Next slide. The Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel is a major transportation corridor, and completion of this project will accommodate increasing transportation needs in the area. The project will have many impacts to resources within VMRC's jurisdiction. Construction activities include construction of trestle bridges, expansion of islands, boring of tunnels, construction of piers, a replacement bulkhead, and the placement of mooring piles and mooring buoys. Resources impacted include SAV, resident and anadromous fishes, birds, and benthic communities. Staff has been highly involved in developing appropriate mitigation for all resources impacted and is in agreement with the mitigation package offered by the applicant. While staff understands and appreciates the concerns raised by the advisory agencies and citizens for the HRBT expansion project, we also recognize the overwhelming public need and benefit of expanding the existing roadway. Staff believes that the impacts to state-owned submerged lands have been minimized to the maximum extent possible, and that the proposed mitigation package is appropriate for the resources that will be impacted. Accordingly, after evaluating the merits of the project against the concerns expressed by those in opposition to the project, and after considering all the factors contained in 28.2-1205 of the Code of Virginia, staff recommends approval of project with conditions added to the permit. And I will let you know that we have had a request from the applicant to add language to some of the permit conditions that were given to you in your evaluations. And I will go over those changes once I get to those particular permit conditions. So the first set of permit conditions are related to dredging. The first permit conditions, the first one is related to a post-dredge bathymetric survey, that they will not dredge deeper than the permitted depths. A pre-dredging conference will be arranged, and we will allow them to maintenance dredge until the permit expires on November 1st, 2026. Next slide. The next set of permit conditions are related to sound attenuation. These include the use of cushion blocks, ramp-up procedures, and bubble curtains on impact driving of hollow steel piles in water depths 20 feet or greater. Next slide. Next are conditions related to mitigation. So these are the conditions that the applicant has requested that we make changes to from what was written in the evaluation. The first condition is related to the acoustic monitoring study. The applicant is requesting that the language in bold and underline be added to the permit condition. So this reads that the permit condition shall be satisfied upon approval of a final study plan by VMRC. Next slide. The next mitigation-related permit condition is for the fish passage study. Again, the applicant is requesting that the language in bold and underline be added to the permit condition. And so this just clarifies that the permit condition will be considered satisfied upon approval of the final study plan by VMRC and contribution of $100,000 into escrow or similar mechanism encumbering the funds to implement fish passage projects. Next slide. The last mitigation-related permit condition is for the SAV seeding contract with VIMS. Again, the applicant is requesting that the language in bold and underline be added to the permit condition. And that reads that the permit condition shall be satisfied upon execution of the contract with VIMS. Staff is in agreement to all the proposed changes requested by the applicant. Next slide. The next two permit conditions are related to the beneficial use of sandy dredge material on public beaches where possible, and then the donation of clean concrete to the VMRC Artificial Reefs program. Any material that cannot be used beneficially will be disposed of at an approved upland disposal site. Next slide. The next condition relates to permit modifications. And it says that any future modifications to this permit shall be submitted to VMRC staff and undergo the appropriate public interest review. So long as the modification is not protested within the current project footprint and is determined to be acceptable to VMRC staff, it can be approved administratively without being heard at a commission meeting. And then the last permit condition is for a transfer of the permit to VDOT upon their acceptance of the project. This concludes my presentation for the HRBT expansion project. And if you have any questions, I will take them at this time.
Thank you, Allison. It was a very thorough briefing on a very, very important project. Do any members of the commission have any questions for Ms. Lay, for Allison?
Christy Everett.
Christy, proceed, please.
Thank you. Just, I guess, 2 points of clarification, or one for requesting further information. maybe this was in the comments with Vim's comments, but was it said that the SAB seeding would be, that's part of the mitigation strategy? Because I know it was mentioned that the mitigation for SAB would occur by VIMS for, I think, 20,000 square feet. Just want a little bit more information. Is there direct restoration and then the mitigation is separate, or is that the same thing?
Ms. Lay, do you want to handle that, or you want VIMS to handle it?
I can give you your answer, and if you need any further comments, VIMS can add in. So the mitigation is for the reseeding of the area that will be directly impacted. So this is looked at as an in-kind mitigation. So the applicant will be paying VIMS to go out to that site next to the North Trestle Bridges, and seeding will be performed for the 20,816 total square feet that will be impacted by the project. That includes both the shading from the temporary work trestles as well as the permanent pile. If the area that is directly impacted by those, by the shading, not be restored appropriately by seeding, then areas directly adjacent to it are being considered in the Hampton Flats area, as well as an area in the Pocosin Banks area.
Did that answer your question, Ms. Everett?
Yes. Could I ask a follow-up question to either
Yes, ma'am.
or Vic?
Yes, ma'am,
Just
please.
a little bit. Thank you. Just related to that same proposal, would that be seeding of eelgrass or widgeon grass? And I guess it sounded like in that explanation, there was a contingent that if it's not successful in that area, then there's kind of these contingent areas such as the Hampton Flats where it could be planted, and just wanted to understand a little bit more about, the type and nature of that initial seeding, and then the contingency if that proposed, Plan A area is not successful.
Ms. Lay?
I think I'll pass that one over to VIMS to give some more detailed information.
Who will be responding from VIMS?
Emily Hine will be responding for this for VIMS.
Hello, Emily. Would you proceed, please? Thank you.
Certainly. So the SAB bed that will be impacted for the project is persistent eelgrass. And we expect that once the temporary structures, the trestles are removed, that area will be recolonized by the eelgrass, and our planting will help ensure that that happens quickly. If something changes over the 5 years of the project, that the exact area where the temporary trestles aren't as conducive for the eelgrass to recolonize, then we'll be expanding that same bed into the Hampton Flats area is the plan.
Ms. Everett, did that answer your question?
It did, and just one small clarification. So it sounds like Ms. Hine, VIMS is responsible for obviously following that path forward and ensuring that there is that success. You all are, kind of committed to follow through in this process.
Yes, that is correct. We will follow through with the project, and then it will be part of our ongoing monitoring efforts in perpetuity.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Bowman. All my questions are answered.
Thank you, ma'am. Anyone else have questions of Allison or VIMS or anyone?
I had a question, Ed Tankard.
Mr. Tankard, proceed, please.
There were 2 time of year restrictions, and I maybe I missed it, but I kind of wanted to know the how we're going to figure out which one we're going to go with, and a little bit more of the mechanics involved in that decision process.
Yeah, so VIMS recommended their typical time of year restriction from February 15th through June 30th to be most protective of species. And then they also recommended an altered time of year restriction from February 15th through April 30th if the first would delay the project too much. So VMRC staff has determined that any time of year restriction would cause a delay in the project that could be harmful economically and potentially environmentally for extending the construction process over more years. So in lieu of staff recommending a time of year restriction, we decided to come up with the acoustic mitigation plan, mitigation study, as well as the fish passage mitigation study. And that was our decision in lieu of recommending any time of year restriction.
Follow up, Mr. Tankard, or is that good?
Yeah, no, I'm better understanding, but essentially we don't have a time of year restriction, is what you're saying.
Correct. Staff is not recommending a time of year restriction. It is up to the commission to decide if they want to accept that recommendation.
Mr. Tankard, I've discussed that with staff, and it seems to me that the science that potentially could come out of that study would be certainly beneficial going forward with other projects and would really be of help. I looked into that with not just Allison, but with the senior staff. Randy Owen and Tony Watkinson and I discussed this, and we believe that the information that could be gleaned from those studies would be very valuable.
Commissioner, I appreciate that. I'm sure that you all have done your best on this. I just wanted to make sure I understood the mechanics of how we had gotten there. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Further questions? Members of the commission?
Dr. Neal, I have a question basically concerning the same thing.
Dr. Neal?
All right, so, there's no question this project is absolutely needed. I really appreciate that you're using this project to help with beach replenishment and helping our artificial reef enhancement program and all that kind of good stuff. The time of year, not having a time of year restrictions, how much of a heartburn is that giving VIMS?
I'll let VIMS answer that. Emily, you want to answer that, or is Dr. Lukenbach on? Or
Sure. I actually have Dr. Troy Tuckey on the line with us from our fisheries department to answer that question, if it's all right with you.
Great, sure. Dr. Tuckey, good to have you with us, sir.
Thank you, sir. It's good to be here. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes, sir. Loud and clear.
Okay. Well, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity and the question that's been posed. Hull steel piles being driven in the bay always give me heartburn. The potential effects of the impact hammers and the effects on the fishes, while the science is still rather young, we know that there are harmful effects from the pilings being struck by impact hammers. This project is enormous. There's thousands of pilings that are going to be driven, and that's thousands of strikes, multiple strikes on each piling. So you're talking about thousands of very loud noises entering the water column. The species that I was concerned about for the time of year and the recommendation were both the migrating anadromous adults heading up to spawn. They don't necessarily follow a river channel. They will swim wherever they wish. So it can be waters that are shallower than 20 feet and deeper than 20 feet. They just go where they want. And so that I would recommend time of year restrictions to allow them the opportunity to reach the spawning grounds and then, and do their thing. The other part of the time of year restrictions was to protect the juveniles. So the nursery habitat for these fishes is up in the tidal freshwater regions, and they're in there for many months. But at the end of the year, say October, November, December-ish, they start swimming down and they will stage. These are the young of the year American shad, blueback, herring, and alewife. They will stage in the lower parts of the James River as well as the York and the Rappahannock River. We have many decades of trawling, trawl survey data that shows this happens year after year. And they will hang out in those regions and wait for whatever the cue is. Probably water temperature, it could be a light cue. I'm not really sure what the cue is. It tells them that it's time to leave. But they'll start leaving the system around April, May. They'll disappear and go offshore in the continental shelf and won't return until they reach sexual maturity. So the time of year would both protect the spawning adults heading upstream, as well as those juveniles that are milling about in this area, waiting for the cues to leave the system. So that's why I had recommended time of year restrictions. And then the bubble curtains and the ramp up procedures was more protective of those species, as well as the resident species that come into the bay. Young year summer flounder will be found in these areas, Atlantic croaker, spot, all the fishes. And then in addition, new information from another study that we have ongoing in the James River up by the power station in Burwell Bay and Hog Island. We are monitoring or catching blue catfish for a diet study, and we're using gill nets. We hired a waterman to fish those nets. And since March of this year, in the gill nets that he's fishing every 2 weeks, we've caught 35 juvenile Atlantic sturgeon in those nets. They're about 12 to 18 inches in length. So these are the young sturgeon that had successfully survived from the 2018-2019 year class. So they're now moving down the James River. And so it's those fishes that I'm also concerned about. Time of year wouldn't necessarily affect the juveniles because they're obviously not in spawning migrations, but they are milling about and feeding and foraging in the James River at this point. So those are my concerns. I understand the scale of the project and the sort of decisions that you folks have to wrestle with, but my perspective is based on protecting the fishes. And so those were the recommendations that I made. I'm happy to expand or answer any other questions.
Dr. Tuckey, this is Steve Bowman. I do have a question. Going back to the studies that will be conducted, what type of benefit do you think futuristically they could likely have for the protection of the same species that you're concerned with protecting?
So you're asking about the acoustic studies. I just got the revised version of the mitigations sound studies on Saturday, so I started reading through it, but haven't digested all of the materials. It would be super beneficial to have those data. If we can agree upon the right design of the study, and then I think we'll have some opportunities to go back and forth with the applicants and refine that and see if we can come to an agreement. But the acoustic surveys, such as the DIDSON or the more modern ARIS sonar, actually allow you to have a digital image of resources in the water. You can see fish swimming. So being able to set that up on a piling as it is struck with an impact hammer, you can see the behaviors of the fishes. We won't know if the fishes are harmed or impacted because we're not collecting fishes. That's a really complicated question, but we can at least see their behaviors, their responses. And then with some of the other sampling that this team has put forward to sort of ground truth what species are in the area, they'll do some additional collections. It would be very beneficial. And if we can design it to look at multiple pilings and many different depths and strata, and some with bubble curtains and without bubble curtains, it would really tell us whether the bubble curtains are achieving the sound attenuation that we're hopeful about, and whether that affects or fish behaviors. So I think this has great opportunity to demonstrate for our species in our region that we're concerned about how they handle noise in the water. Most of the sound studies that have been conducted, or lots of them, have been on the West Coast, and there's some up in the Tappan Zee Bridge in New York. It's great information, but we have different species, different conditions, and so having data that's local would really help. And I'm excited to work with this team and see what we can get out of this to educate future decisions. So I am hopeful that something very beneficial will come out of the acoustic study. And then the mitigation for anadromous fish, opening up other habitats, fish passage structures or dam removals, whatever is deemed the best by those agencies, could certainly have an effect on anadromous fish. So they're positive mitigation measures, but they're not directly associated with some of the species that may be affected by this construction project. We're not proposing to do anything that helps summer flounder, for example, that will be in this vicinity. But it's a pretty good plan, and I'm excited to see how it helps us.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Neal, did you have follow up?
No. So yeah, no.
Thank you, sir. Anyone else on the commission have a question, comment? Thank you, folks. Is the applicant present or represented or wishes to be heard?
Hi, good morning. This is Jose Martin. I'm the representative for Hampton Road Connector Partners. We're present and we're happy to answer any other questions if there's any.
Thank you, sir. Any questions? Any other questions by members of the commission? Thank you, sir. Is there anyone here in opposition to the project wishes to be heard? Hearing none, the matter is before the commission for discussion and action.
Well, I'll move to accept staff recommendation. This is Dr.
Motion made by Dr. Neal to accept staff recommendation. Is there a
James
second?
James Minor, second.
Thank you, sir. Further discussion? Mr. France?
Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
You can hear me?
Yes, sir. How do you vote?
Well, I'm not going to vote yet. I have some comments.
Oh, I'm sorry, sir. I didn't. Okay. Proceed, please.
Yeah, I would just like to say, you know, since I've been on this commission and we've had construction that was occurring in the spring and early winter months, even if it was 2 or 3 pilings in just a out of the way little creek or something, you know, we had made excuses or you know, forgotten the time of view restrictions. You know, I don't know if I could support this without some kind of restrictions. I mean, you might be talking about excluding a whole class of and return downward from this activity.
I think, Mr. France, there have been times when I've been on the commission. I specifically remember, I think the Jordan Bridge was a case where, in lieu of time of year restrictions, bubble curtains were used to attenuate the sound. So this, I would say that this is not a unique scenario. If any staff is on that wishes to comment, Tony, you still on by chance?
Yes, sir, Commissioner. I'm here. I think Allison covered it, but I really just want to reiterate here that, you know, considering the public benefit of the project, you know, staff just didn't feel it was appropriate to delay the construction that would result from the time of year. And while we might want to hear from the applicant about the time frame of extending the project, it was significant. It was months towards years or a year or so if some of these time of year restrictions were in place. And so that was a significant issue. The other is it's not in the spawning areas where we have the most concern for these types of construction activities. It is in the lower bay. Obviously, fish migrate through the area. That is a concern. But given the scope and scale of the project and the width of the waterway in that area of Hampton Roads, we thought it was best to go with the mitigation measures in this situation rather than risk delaying this important public transportation project.
Mr. France, further comments, sir?
Yeah, I guess my next kind of question would be that by allowing them to proceed in the spring month, then we could be maybe saving multiple year classes by not extending this thing further than what it is. If that statement is right, and if you understand that, if that statement's correct, then I would support this.
All right. Thank you, sir. Further comment by members of the commission? I'll call the roll. Mr. France? Mr. Tankard?
Aye.
Mr. Zedrin? Mr. Zedrin?
Aye.
Thank you. Dr. Neal?
Aye.
Mr. Ballard?
Aye.
Mr. Minor?
Aye.
Ms. Lusk? Ms. Lusk?
Aye.
Thank you. Ms. Everett?
Aye.
Chair votes aye. Motion passes unanimously. Thank you very much. Is there anything else to come before the commission this day? I see nothing else left on the agenda. If not, I thank everyone for their understanding and their attention today. Again, I look forward to the day that we can be back together safely. I wish you well, wish you safety, and take care. Thank you so much for your service to the Commonwealth. Good day.
Good day.
Thank you, sir. Have a good day.
Too, buddy.